Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Pleasure to welcome to the program Dr. Keon West, Associate Professor of Psychology at Goldsmiths University, London, author of The Science of Racism, Everything You Need to Know But Probably Don't Yet. Doctor, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks. That's very nice of you.
Let me ask you this. It just struck me, from my days of schooling, coming from the psychology department, doing what would be considered what sounds to me sort of like almost like a sociological endeavor. Why did you take this approach? Because it is a very data-driven approach to the existence of racism.
Okay. So I think that's worth answering in a number of ways. So first of all, I'm not an associate professor at Goldsmiths. That wouldn't be true for some time.
That explains everything.
Yeah. So I've been a visiting professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science instead. And I've been working in this area for quite a while at a number of different universities. And I think there's a perception amongst other people that psychology really is a science without numbers, that it's a science of doing things and then hearing what people feel and how people think. And it's a lot of qualitative, a lot of writing stuff down. And that is true. There is some qualitative research, but I think people underestimate the vast amount of aggressively quantitative, aggressively numerical psychological stuff. And I think that's sometimes hidden by the way that we talk about, think about, present psychology in the media. But the fact is we do a lot of numbers and a huge amount of statistics, and we care about them enormously. And that's why we tend to align with the political scientists and with other such scientists more than with people who write things down about feelings.
All right, great. All right. With that said, let's just start with the question you ask at the first part of your book is, how do we know if racism is real? And in this country, there has been, by some, a contention that, well, to the extent that racism was ever real, it ended when we had elected a black president in this country, proof that there is no more racism. But how do we know that racism, or before we even get to that, let's distinguish between the idea of what is and what is not racism.
Sure.
Define racism for us so that we can differentiate it from prejudice, preference, even discrimination.
Sure. So I think there's a lot of concepts there, each of which could be a whole chapter defining them. I don't like to do that. I hate the long-winded definitions. For me, I will define racism, and have in the book, as any detectable difference in treatment that can be explained by race and cannot be explained by any other thing. So what does that mean in even simpler terms? It means if two people do exactly the same thing, but they are different races and they get exactly the same treatment, no racism. If they get different treatment, racism. Very, very simple. And that bleeds really easily into your other question, well, how do we test for racism? And to do that, you just create any set of stimuli. So the one I start with in the book is a CV. So you could take my CV or your CV, make a couple hundred or a couple thousand copies of exactly the same CV. And then all you have to do is change the names at the tops of the CV to make it look like a white person sent them, or a black person sent them, or a Latino sent them, or a Chinese person sent them, or whatever. And if all the names get the same callbacks, the same job offers, the same offers of payment, no racism. If there is a difference, though, and since we kept everything stable except for the race of the people sending the CVs, any differences are racism. That's how you detect the racism.
And how do you detect it in things like societal structures, right? Like, I mean, I think about the way our cities are. We're here in New York City. Robert Moses constructed our public transportation in a way that disproportionately disadvantaged Black people in the city. I mean, the pools were colder, and it's more difficult to get to the beach if you were in a neighborhood that was more traditionally Black or lower income. That's a more systemic view, right? How do you test that in your analysis?
So the systemic racism isn't the thing that's normally tested for with the kind of experiments that I do. And I don't want to say that it's not important or it's not interesting, and I do mention it in the book as well. It's incredibly important. It's my area, slightly more in the experimental psychology of things. So I like to say, do people respond differently to this race versus that race? What I think is interesting about the systemic racism is that there's often a telltale trail. Sometimes, for example, people will quite literally just write it down. So they will say, we don't want Black people living in this neighborhood. So there'll be clauses, for example, in certain houses that say you can't sell them to Black people. And that's just written down. So we know that's a systemic thing. In the case of the British immigration system, there is a document where they say, we do not want non-white immigrants. How can we keep them out? And then they explain a system by which they only take some paperwork and not other paperwork. Sometimes they're not so nice as to write it down. So it'd be great if racist people wrote everything down when they decided to be racist, but they're normally not so obliging. Instead, what tends to happen is that there's particular statistical patterns, which, for example, can be seen in the American voting system. So we know that people who aren't white are much less likely to have certain forms of ID, and these forms of ID are required to vote. And just by putting those two things together, you end up with systemic racism, where people who aren't white are less likely to vote. You could change this by changing the ID or changing the requirement, as many other countries do. But if you don't, what you end up with is a systemic form of racism.
And that, when we're talking about that, is sort of a de facto racism, right? We're not talking about, in your work here, is specifically about trying to show where it exists within society in a specific data-driven way. So let's get back to the hiring. We talked about the CVs.
Yep.
How do we know in the process, and one of the things you do in the book is really sort of like tease out almost, I guess, the process as much. I mean, there's a certain amount of like sort of lesson about how you do science in these situations.
Yes.
So how do we know that? Yep. How do we know that the CV reader reads this name as being, I mean, I think maybe Hispanic is a little bit more self-evident, but like as being Black or, non-white?
Sure. There are many different ways you could know that. So, for example, one of the experiments uses a name that just sounds very stereotypically Black, like Jamal Jenkins. And most people who you send that to and you say, guess the race of this person, they will agree, oh, this person sounds Black to me. And you can do that with a bunch of other names, and you get other names that people agree sound Indian, agree sound Chinese, agree sound white. And so that's one way of testing it. These experiments, though, don't just use names. So they also sometimes use pictures, which is, again, much easier. And I know there's some ambiguity even in pictures. You could look at pictures and you could think a person's white, Black, or Latino or something else. But generally, people tend to agree. Some of these experiments use actual human beings who go in and present themselves with exactly the same qualifications. And these are people who genuinely identify as white, Black, or Latino. And the thing is, it doesn't really matter how you do it, whether you use the names or the pictures or the people, you tend to get the same results. And when all the results converge in that way, it becomes really hard to say, well, maybe this really strange, incredibly reliable, systematic difference between the way these CVs are accepted and those CVs are accepted is due to anything other than race. It just becomes really difficult to explain it any other way.
Let's talk about the other areas where you have both done your own research and have sort of compiled, I guess, aggregated different studies. We see it. One of the ones that struck me was the teachers assessing the behavior of I think it was kindergarten students.
Yes, very, very young students. I think they were 3 to 5. Though don't quote me on that. I mean, they were really quite young.
And okay, walk us through what that experiment showed as well.
Yeah, so this wasn't one of my experiments, although it's one I really like because it's one where we get to break out some of the fancy equipment. And the fancy equipment in this case was eye tracking software, so to see where are the teachers looking. And you can have two conditions then. You just put the eye tracking equipment on the teachers and see who they look at. And sometimes they look at this child, sometimes they look at that child. But then you tell the teachers, look out, there's going to be some bad behavior in this classroom. Some of these are naughty children. I think the actual words they used in the experiment was challenging behaviors. They're going to be some challenging behaviors in the classroom. And then you can see where the teachers start looking. And when the teachers were told to look out for the challenging behavior, they hyper-focused on the Black children, and in particular, the Black boys. They didn't look at the white children as much, even though none of the children were behaving badly. And what this showed is that by the time children, and these were real instructors, by the way, real teachers from a teacher conference, and this shows that by the time children are 3 to 5, they're already dealing with racism. Their teachers are already expecting more negative things from them. And we can't pretend that this is something we can start dealing with when they're 7 or 10, because that's years of just enduring lower expectations and greater expectations of bad behavior by the time we start to talk about it.
In these experiments, is the race of the human resources person or the teacher, is that predictive of how they're going to respond to the different races that they're viewing or assessing, so on?
Sadly, the answer is not nearly as predictive as we'd hope it would be. So we'd like to imagine, for example, that if I were to send all these CVs out and white people were to get them, then they'd do that reliable thing where they'd pick more white people than Black people or offer the white people more money. But if we were to send it to Black human resource people, they shouldn't do that, right? Or they might even over-select the Black people. Unfortunately, that's not really what happens. Sometimes you can get situations in which Black people over-select other Black people, in which they're nicer to other Black people. But generally, no. What you find is that ethnic minorities tend to perpetuate the same patterns of discrimination that white people do. It can be softened a bit and it can be less reliable. But far too often, when you conduct these experiments, the race of the person doing the picking doesn't actually change whether they offer more jobs or better jobs. That is an unfortunate finding.
Was that assessed in the context of the teachers too? Because I would imagine that there may be a different perspective depending on what profession you're in. I think
about police officer, for example.
Well, and you could run that to, because we're going to get to police in a moment. But
it wasn't assessed. Yeah, for the teachers in that one, it wasn't. But there's other similar research. So, for example, there was one on prospective PhD students who send, if I don't know if you've ever thought about doing a PhD, but you have to send an email to a professor saying, hello, so-and-so, I'd like you to be my supervisor. And this was thousands of emails sent. And they did change the name of the person sending the email to sound white or Black. And they did send them to a number of different professors. So white professors, Black professors, all sorts of races of professors. And in that experiment, they found that it wasn't predictive at all. The race of the professor made no difference in any way. So again, the experiments aren't all exactly the same. Some of them will show a bit of an effect this way or a bit of an effect that way. But the overall conclusion from a lot of experiments is you cannot solve this problem just by getting in more Black teachers or more Black professors. They will continue generally the same patterns of discrimination.
Before we get to the dynamics of police and policing, what other sectors? Is there another sector that sticks out to you where there's an experiment that is particularly egregious or noteworthy in your mind?
Well, I won't mention police because you mentioned that you want to get to that later.
I will get to that in just a moment.
Right now. But there is the experiment with the doctor's offices where Black, white, and Latino people call in with the same symptoms and statuses, and the white people get offered appointments sooner. There's the other one in which Black and white people present with the same symptoms, but white people are more likely to get the life-saving heart whatever treatment, a myocardial infarction treatment, which I think is just a heart attack. I'm not that kind of doctor, but the white people are more likely to get the right treatment for that, and the Black people are less likely to. Those strike me as particularly horrifying because they could kill you. And this is important. This is important not to know that. But it's in romance, and it's in friendship, and it's in the way that we treat children, and it's the way children treat each other. It's in everything. Like, there's not a sector where you don't find this. And I think that's the really depressing thing. If you can think of any way that we could test anything, you could send people into shops, you could put them on dating websites, you could make them sell things on eBay. If you can change the skin color of the person doing those things, you will find effects based on that. And you find that essentially every time. It's
a different sort of, I guess, qualitative inquiry, but and then I want to get to the cops. But is there a difference? I mean, to what extent have you delved into the why? Like, and if the motivation for these things after the fact, like a lot of times I know with the CV stuff, you can't really contact the HR people because otherwise it's tough to maintain future experiments. Like they literally hire or don't hire these people and don't ever hear back. And that's part of the to maintain the integrity of the experiments. But is there, does the why stuff, like what, I cannot remember the author that we spoke to years ago, but I think she followed a similar inquiry based upon just sort of like, I think her own child being on an airplane, being nervous, her own child who was black, being nervous when there was another black person who came onto the airplane or something, responding to whatever the media or society has been sort of like communicating on some level to this child. Do we have a sense of like what motivates these things?
So several things motivate these things. And I think that has to be acknowledged. In a big way, I think in recent times, we've leaned into the idea that this is all motivated by unconscious bias, that people don't realize that they're seeing things differently or behaving differently because some people are white and some people are black. And the unconscious bias literature is big and complicated, and I do touch on it in the book. And some of it is a kind of bias that we don't realize we have. So that's absolutely true. However, it's also incredibly important to acknowledge that sometimes the evidence shows really clearly there is nothing unconscious about this bias. People are perfectly aware of what they're doing, and they're doing it on purpose. There's a really great experiment that I do talk about in the book, in which they send actual human beings, not just the CVs, but one's white, one's black, one's Latino. And people do all sorts of interesting things. They tell the black person, oh, we're going to have to call to see about your references, but they don't say that to the white person or the Latino person.
And to be clear, these are people go in with the exact same references.
Exactly the same references.
Everything is the same. The dress that they're wearing is the same. Everything's the same except for...
the same, yeah. And in fact, not only do the people lie, they know they're lying. There was one person who was really quite clever. She told the black person, oh, sorry, there's no interviews, everyone go. And then when they all left, all three of them left, she called the white and the Latino person back and said, oh, you two forgot to sign something. And when they came back into the office, she said, I was lying. You didn't forget to sign anything. I just needed to get rid of the black guy. Can you start working? So the idea that people are unconscious of the bias is just not true. And I think this was a 2009 study, but there's definitely more recent studies that show that people lie. I mean, she's probably still working somewhere. She's probably still hiring people somewhere. And we have to be aware of this, that yes, sometimes there are genuine differences in perception based on bias, and that is true. But sometimes people know exactly what they're doing, and that is also true. We have to be aware of both.
Let's talk about police interactions.
Yes.
I am told by people who refute the idea that black people are treated differently, at least in the context of the United States, by police than white people in terms of like being met with violence by the police. That that is wrong. What is the sort of the data show here?
Yes. I always think that's such a bold claim to say that, black people aren't treated differently by the police, because that would imply the person's looked over quite a lot of data and has a really sound understanding of it.
We operate in a YouTube world where claims like that are not formulated from extensive research or even reading about people's extensive research.
Yeah. So I would say, based on the extensive research, that position is untenable. It's entirely ridiculous. And this is a lot of research. So if you're looking at just the statistics of it, you see that, yes, black people are much more likely to face violence at the hands of the police in the US and in other countries. So in the UK, where I live, research shows that black people are 8 to 9 times more likely to be tased than white people, and that this cannot be explained by any other aspect of the interaction, not by what they were doing or the crimes that they were accused of, or whether or not they were armed or whether or not they resisted. In fact, the data coming out of the United States shows that Black people who are in fact shot by police officers are much more likely to be unarmed than white people who are shot by police officers. So there's quite a lot of gaps that aren't explained statistically. But I think the thing you're really interested in was the experiment with the kind of video game. I think that's the one that gets people's interest. And to explain that, I have tried explaining this before, but I need to get more up-to-date video games. So I know that the young people are playing Fortnite. I have never played Fortnite, but I gather that you shoot people in Fortnite. Yes, I mean,
Correct.
Okay, so Emma's smiling. Yes, you shoot people in Fortnite.
I
So
know
imagine-
less than you.
Okay. So imagine a version of Fortnite in which every time someone crosses your path and they have a gun, you have to shoot them. And every time they cross your path and they don't have a gun, you shouldn't shoot them. If you shoot them, something goes wrong, right? So that's an easy video game. You shoot the people with guns, you don't shoot the people without guns. But now we change one more thing. Half of the people are white, half of the people are Black. So sometimes there's a white person with a gun, a Black person with a gun, a white person with no gun, Black person with no gun. And then if you're an experimenter, you can see the mistakes that people make. Do they accidentally shoot certain people with no guns? And the answer is yes. And that's much more likely to be the Black people in this little Fortnite experiment. And do they accidentally fail to shoot people who actually do have guns? Yes, but that's much more likely to be the white people. And so we can see that for police, because they ran this on police and they ran it on civilians, for both groups, there is a tendency to overshoot unarmed Black people and to undershoot armed white people. And this is a real problem we have. What the experiments did find is that police are much better at shooting the right people than civilians. I think the researchers actually use the words trigger happy to describe the civilians, which I know will get under people's skin. But when you see the data, it's an excellent argument for not letting everyone have a gun, which I know is a right that Americans really care about. But it's a terrifying right when you look at who they accidentally shoot. You need training to have a gun, says the science. But I don't want to get under people's skin by saying that.
So, does those experiments also suggest that training can mitigate the sort of like instant reaction to assume to associate Black person with threat of having a gun in that instance, but not so much as it would save, I mean, not as much as we would hope.
So the training mitigates it. That's one thing that can mitigate it. Another thing that can mitigate it, which I don't think I talked about in the book, but it was another set of studies by the same researchers. So if you're interested, it's by Corral and Judd. They did a lot of research on guns and who shoots who and who doesn't. But not only training, you can also just change the punishment and reward schedules. And that also changes who gets shot and who doesn't get shot. So if you get into a lot of trouble for shooting certain people and not so much trouble for shooting other people, that tends to be where your mistakes go, which is another disturbing aspect of how this works. So in general, the effect doesn't go away with the police. That's not true at all. The police definitely enact violence in racialized patterns. But we know that we can handle this or reduce it. We know how to make it go down. It's just that not everyone does that.
I also, what I found interesting was the data on, we hear a lot of like Black on Black crime is one of the talking points that we hear quite a bit in this country. And it turns out that crime generally takes place amongst people of the same race, regardless of their race.
Yes. So you do hear a lot about Black on Black crime, the argument being whenever there is data presented that some group of people have harmed Black people, so let's say the police are brutalizing Black people, the idea is, well, the real problem is Black on Black crime. If you're a Black person, you're most likely to be killed by another Black person, which is true. But it's also true that if you're a white person, you're most likely to be killed by another white person. If you're an Indian person, you're most likely to be killed by another Indian person. If you're a Chinese person, you're most likely to be killed by another Chinese person. And I don't mean in India or in China, I mean in the United States of America. The way it works is you're most likely, unfortunately, to be killed by people you live near, people you know, people you hang around. I actually don't know if this is true, but I vaguely remember on the internet, so do not cite this. I hate when people cite random numbers from the internet. But I heard somewhere that the most likely person to kill any given woman is her own husband. And most women marry husbands of the same race. So the way it works is you're probably going to be killed by someone of your own race. And so black on black crime, while it is a thing, it's not a real thing. If it were, we should be talking about white on white crime, but we don't. And we never use it to excuse brutality against white people. That would be a horrifying, crass thing to do. But some people do it to excuse violence against black people.
I don't know that I've ever heard a politician say the words white on white crime.
Well, there's a lot of it. There's quite a bit of it.
I've heard a lot of politicians say black on black crime, but I've never heard one say white on white crime. Let's talk about you've written not so much in the context of this book, but I know in the wake of the sort of the DEI. Let's talk about that a little bit in terms of when we talk about sort of, well, before we get to DEI, or maybe as a good prelude to get talking about DEI, let's talk about the idea of reverse racism and this concept of white people being subject to racism. I mean, we have this idea of where you can make an assessment based upon what we call, race, and two people similarly situated will have different outcomes. And obviously you got to run this experiment many, many times to assess whether the decisions that are impacting these outcomes are guided by the race of the subject. But where does the concept of power come into this, and really being in a position to make the decisions come into this? And then we'll get into so-called reverse racism that people talk about.
So I think that's a huge question. I'll see if I can break it down and address all the parts of it. So I hear the worry that some white people have, especially in the wake of things like diversity and inclusion and affirmative action, that what's happening now in society, the issue in American society, is that if you're a white person, you're now being underprivileged relative to equally qualified people of color. And that's why people say phrases like, oh, look, she's just a DEI hire or something like that. But I can say categorically, this is not happening. No research supports the idea that this is happening. So if you're a white person and you're worried that people who are like black people who are as qualified as you are taking the jobs you're supposed to get, this is not a concern you should have. You should spend your time worrying about anything else. All the research shows that white people are still much more likely to be selected for everything than equally qualified people of color. So if that's the case, what are they worried about? And I could see a theoretical worry that, for example, some people are putting things in place that say deliberately you should hire people of color, or you should hire women, or you should hire whoever else, even if they're not that qualified. Or because the tide has shifted so aggressively, you could imagine me as a black person saying, well, I hate white people. I don't want them to do well in society, so I'm going to block them at every turn. I'm going to stop them from getting the good jobs. But again, practically, this isn't something I think white people ever need to worry about, or at least certainly not for the foreseeable future. None of the data support the idea that, A, this is happening. That's not true. Actually, most people who aren't white really like white people and genuinely want to get along with them and like them very much. There's just no evidence of widespread dislike of white people, at least nothing that matches in general the way white people see people of color. But also, even if they all did hate white people, the truth is the power structures just aren't set up for people of color to enact the kind of widespread negativity against white people that even if we wanted to, we couldn't do it. We just don't have the numbers.
Does this, to the point about, it being kind of downstream from like how we structure our society, of course, like, does this ebb and flow? Is there an increase in more overt racism in certain periods of history where perhaps, I don't know, we're in a very far right reactionary time right now in this country. I wonder if that affects the data or if it's controlled for or if it's as uniform across time periods as anything.
So I'd say it's not uniform across time periods or across countries at all. So if we think back historically, there are obvious, huge crescendos in explicit racism. I think the most obvious one being, 1939 to 1945. That's, I suppose, for some people within kind of living memory. And things were definitely a lot more racist then. I think what people forget is that there were aggressive eugenicists on both sides of the Atlantic, that there were British eugenicists and American eugenicists, and that the break from the Nazi eugenicists happened much later than many people realize, that there were big pushes in racism. And we've been talking a lot about white on black racism, but we forget the kind of obvious, aggressive, explicit racism against Japanese Americans, for example, or Native Americans, for example, that comes in and out, that goes in its own crescendos. I'd say in general, the longer you go back, the further back in history you go, the worse things are if you're not white for about 400 years. So I wouldn't want to live 50 years ago. I think life now is much better than 50 years ago. I wouldn't want to live 100 years ago. And if I had to pick, I'd pick 50 over 100. I wouldn't want to live 200 years ago. And if I had to pick, I'd pick 100 over 200. But that said, there's definitely mini cycles, and we do account for that. We do take that into account. The data stretches over a really long period of time. So we've been collecting data on stuff like this for about 70 years. But part of that is acknowledging that things do change. That I said we talk a lot about unconscious bias, and that was true for the last 5 years. I think for the next 5 years, people might be talking more about very, very conscious bias again, because there is more of that in some places.
That sort of foreshadows one of my final questions, particularly after having an experience recently in sort of a debate with people where this stuff was quite explicit. But what accounts for that? I mean, if there is variation within time, broad strokes over the past 400 years, it has moved in one direction. But if there are spikes and dips, what accounts for it? In at least in your assessment, and to what extent does economics and culture play into those spikes, changes in both those realms?
Oh, so that is a huge question as well. What accounts for it is hard. There's so much that accounts for it. I'd like to focus on two things, because I think there are two things, one of which isn't really that easy to control, and one is easier to control. And one's more money and one's more psychology. And I think I'd like to talk about both because they're useful. So one of the patterns in society is that we tend to become more biased when things are more economically strained. So it's again, I'm not a historian, so take all the historical things I say with a pinch of salt. But there is a pattern in history, which again, you can see in the 1939 to 1945 period, that when people are facing real economic threats, they look for someone to blame. So maybe it's the Jewish people, maybe it's the immigrants, maybe it's the black people, maybe it's whatever other ethnicity it is, but they are the reason we don't have money. Now, this is never true. Why? It doesn't make sense. In the UK, we have a strong thing about people coming across the channel in boats. And we say that they're the reason we don't have money. But obviously, they're not the reason we don't have money, because they don't have the money. We have to ask who has the money. That's obviously the reason we don't have the money. But we blame some group of people, and that kind of economic strain makes people generally less reasonable, less pleasant, and more likely to blame some kind of outsider. The other issue is more psychological, which is just the effect of social norms. If you have it in place, that there are leaders, that there are people who are very influential, who make it plain that being biased is fine, more people are going to be biased. People are kind of governed by their own desires and their own internal pushes and pulls, but we also go along with the crowd. And if the crowd says, it's cool to hate gay people, or it's great to dislike black people, or you shouldn't hang out with Muslims, most people will go along regardless of their internal feelings. And It sounds a bit like high school, but we have to pay attention to what the cool kids are doing, what the popular kids are doing. And if the popular kids are being more racist, the society is going to get more racist.
So, I mean, that's essentially the perils of normalization.
It is a perils of normalization. I prefer to talk about it more in terms of setting the social norms. Normalization can be a slightly different thing. It's a slightly more insidious thing in some ways. So if I were to come on and say, everybody's super racist, racism is terrible because everybody around is super racist, ironically, I might be pushing people to become slightly more racist because I'm normalizing the idea of people being racist. And the truth is actually that most people, most of the time, don't want to think of themselves as racist. Even incredibly racist people, people who are aggressively, overtly racist, don't think of themselves as racist a lot of the time. They think of themselves as fair and reasonable and honest and decent. It's just that they believe some races are genuinely intellectually or morally inferior to others. And I think if you could show them the inconsistency, if you can show most people that their behaviors, their actions, or their beliefs are really quite racist, most people would find that very uncomfortable and want to change.
Let me just jump ahead because I want to talk a little bit about DEI as a mitigating, factor. But what of those who don't feel uncomfortable about it? Like, I mean, I think we're living in an era. This just came up because there was a debate that I did in January, and it with like 20 conservatives, and one of the women came up, and my claim was that if you are not a nationalist xenophobe, then if you are one, then you should be happy that Trump won, or something to that effect. And she came up, she says, what's wrong with being a nationalist xenophobe? We have a white culture, and what's wrong with having that? And I was like, okay, this is not, you've made my argument, but I left that thinking like, there is a comfortability factor. And this is a video she knew she was coming on this. And there's, there's going to be anywhere from 1 to 5 million people who watch that video. And she's proud of it. She was on Twitter, sort of like joyous that she was, sort of like a part of the promo. And my reaction has been two things. Like, one, I was like, this seems to be, people have a lot more confidence with this than they may have 10 years ago expressing this. And two, like, I'm questioning whether I should have been part of that as like, honestly, like, is this...
They're being normalized.
Are they being normalized for in my layman's person of the term? Like, what of those people who are lack any sort of like uncomfortability, and how do we respond to that, and more broadly these other sort of like notions of implicit or unconscious bias?
Yes, so I would say it is a genuine, legitimate criticism of my book that it doesn't really tell people not to be racist, that it isn't. I do say it's not a political book, and I am quite serious about that. It's a scientific book. So it tells people, this is what's happening. This is the racism we know is happening because of science. This is how to make it go up. This is how to make it go down. So theoretically, that woman you were talking about could say, oh, great. And she would grab the book and read it and say, oh, this is how you make it go up. And she'd just love more racism, and she'd really be into that. And in theory, you could use the book that way. What I would say is that most people don't want that. Most people don't like the idea of being racist. And I think we can focus a lot on the people who are very comfortable with being racist. But if we do that, we are kind of doing ourselves a disservice, because we're ignoring the much larger proportion of people who are swayed by some of the arguments of these people, but are deeply uncomfortable with their racism. That said, the book also does touch a bit on what it means to do something about racism. And this is not a scientific question. It is a political question. So take everything I say after this point with a huge grain of salt, because it's just my political opinions. But to some extent, we have a fight on our hands, and we must recognize that. I really respect my pacifist friends. My wife is a pacifist, but I do think anyone who thought you could just sit Hitler down and have a real discussion with him about the error of his ways it's foolish. At some point, the fighting has to start. And when you deal with people who are openly, aggressively biased, openly xenophobic, openly eugenicists, openly genocidal, openly whatever else, at some point, we have to recognize we need to restrict their power, restrict their abilities to influence other people, restrict their ownership of weaponry. You have to start taking these steps because they're willing to take these steps. And you don't want to be surprise attacked by Nazis. I think you want to at least have some preparation in place. But that's my political stance on it. And that's because I don't like racism, but it's not a scientific stance. I think you should do whatever your political stance dictates.
All right. Well, getting back to the sort of the scientific part about how you mitigate it. So, this woman may buy your book and be like, oh, this is great. I have a recipe to increase racism, which, I don't think they would have gotten this far in the interview. So I think we're safe in that regard. But from the perspective of wanting to mitigate, it sounds like the idea is you focus on the uncomfortability that people may have with being racist, one that may be even less specific than their reasons to be racist or their feelings of racism, like a general uncomfortability, a general understanding that this somehow is wrong or, not in the interests of society or whatnot. How do you work on that? And where does like DEI come into that?
So how do I work on that?
Yeah.
I think the first thing is a lot of the rhetoric with people who wouldn't describe themselves as racist, but who I would say would do racist things, really stems from the idea that we live in a good place in a meritocracy. And if whatever other race of people would just do the good thing, they'd get the good result. So when you look at for example, people who complain about DEI, an underlying complaint is that by getting rid of DEI, we're reinforcing a meritocracy. And that's just a lie. It's a huge, important lie. And I think there's a lot of people out there who think that if black and white people just had exactly the same CVs, they'd get exactly the same job offers. If they're made to understand that that just isn't true, that we are not hiring the best people, we're not paying people fairly, we're not promoting people at the right time, then many people do acknowledge that this is a problem and do want it to change. They do want the fairness to happen. So a lot of it is education. If you show people really clear, unambiguous data, which we have, that says that for the same evidence, black people and white people don't go to prison at the same rates and they don't stay in prison for the same amount of time. Again, totally true, totally provable. Most people at that point say, well, that is wrong. I can see that there is something wrong with that. And so most people who are really invested in the meritocracy will really dislike seeing how non-meritocratic society is, and they will want to change it. And those who are just fine saying, well, I want society to work very unfairly and in my favor, now at least we know where they stand and we know who they are. And when it comes specifically to the DEI stuff, I do acknowledge that DEI is imperfect, like really imperfect. And I would say, actually, if I had my way, DEI would be done completely differently. It would be centralized, it would be structured. It would not be based on the whims of what companies wanted, but on something that was more mandated, that was more specific, that was based on scientific research and that we knew actually worked. Because it's kind of a client-driven industry at the moment, companies can do whatever they want, and they can do things that they like or that feels good, but that's not necessarily effective. So that is a real change that must be made. But I wholeheartedly have to say that the idea of getting rid of DEI 100% and thinking this will make anything better is scientifically just nonsense. It will make things worse. We have a problem where people are not treated fairly, where they're not hired at the right rates, where they're not paid the right amount. And we know that this is because of the color of their skin and also because of their gender and sexual orientation and other things. We know this. And so to just scrap the DEI is saying we are comfortable with this and are not planning to do anything about it.
I guess lastly, like what of those who are impervious, who have the implicit bias or the unconscious bias? They're not part of that group of like, oh, I want to read this book to increase racism. But what of that set that where data I mean, we have a problem. I don't know if it's happening in your country to the extent that it is in ours, but we have a problem with people just sort of explicitly not accepting data from scientists. From a more psychological level, is there something else that can sort of go hand in hand with that data that in and of itself, I don't think these days is going to convince anybody?
Well, I want to draw a distinction between people not being convinced by data and people not being convinced by scientists or by research. And I think these are kind of different things. So if I were to come on here and say, I'm a scientist, racism is real, you should believe me, I think a lot of people would say no in America and in other places. And I honestly respect them for that. I don't think you should believe anyone because they come on a program and say, I have a fancy degree, which I do, by the way, very fancy. And therefore you should believe me. That's silly. That's an argument from authority and should be ignored. I also think that people are often presented with data like stats to say racism is a problem, where they say, oh, well, look, Black people are twice as likely to be unemployed as white people. There's racism. And again, that's not convincing. And people are right to step away from that. That doesn't prove that racism is the problem. They're doing the right thing by being skeptical. So if you are one of those people, you get no criticism from me for those two positions. I think what's much harder for people to ignore is properly explained research, which happens too rarely. People don't do that very much. And I have had people challenge me and say, you can't prove that racism happens. And then I say, well, let's make a prediction. There is a great experiment in which they wrote people's names on envelopes and they put the postage already, they put the stamp on it and everything, and they left it on the floor. And so it would take you 2 seconds to pick it up and put it in a mailbox so it can be mailed off somewhere. It's such a nice thing to do. It takes no effort. But if you write a white-sounding name on the envelope or a black-sounding name on the envelope, do you get different results? And I have never met a person who says racism doesn't exist who is willing to make a prediction in that case. Or if they are making a prediction, and then I show them, well, this experiment has been done. Look, the white names get way more posted envelopes than the black names. They don't know what to do. It kind of breaks them a bit because beliefs are prediction-making machines. That's why we have a belief. I believe that cars will hit you if you step in the middle of the road, so I don't do it. But if I step in a road and no car ever hits me, I have to change my belief. I think arsenic is poisonous, but if I eat it and I don't die, I change my belief. And because beliefs are prediction-making machines, if you can get these people to repeatedly make predictions, what do you think is going to happen with these sets of CVs that are completely identical? What do you think is going to happen with these envelopes? What do you think is going to happen with this evidence that's presented to a jury? And if they keep making the wrong prediction, eventually their belief has to break. Whether they admit it or not, they have to acknowledge that their belief isn't predicting reality and they have to change it.
That's fascinating. I'm going to deploy that envelope, scenario. I have a feeling many, many times in the years to come. Dr. Keon West, the author of The Science of Racism, Everything You Need to Know But Probably Don't Yet. We'll put a link to that book at majority.fm and in the podcast and YouTube description. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.